begin our speech, our talk today with Mr. Ballard, who serves as Executive Vice President of International Services for Superior Energy. He's focusing on developing and building out companies' core services in international markets. Mr. Ballard has served as Vice President of Corporate Development since joining the company in June of 2007. Prior to joining Superior, Mr. Ballard spent 6 years working in private equity. And I can tell you, if you're in private equity, it's making sure that the companies that you spend your money on and you invest in are doing the right things. So I can tell you that he has a vast amount of experience, and I'm proud and pleased and honored to introduce Mr. Westy Ballard of Superior.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate those remarks, none of which were true, but I'll take them. And I don't have a lot of remarks, contrary to what Jim said, and also contrary to what Jim said, I am for hire too. We all are in some respects, aren't we? We're delighted to be here, and we've always had a strong showing at Superior with LAGCOE, and this year is no exception, and I think the ensuing years also will be no exception. We've got meaning Superior, has a strong heritage in Lafayette. Many of our operations and many of our headquarters are here, not only support our U.S. operations, but also international operations too. And so we are very proud to be, in many respects, rooted in Lafayette, and look forward to continuing to having that same characteristic as we continue to grow. I am more than capable of boring you to death with a lot of my remarks today, so I'm going to endeavor to keep my comments short, brief, but hopefully they'll be somewhat insightful. Excuse me while I apologize in advance for this. This is something that I'm obligated to show you. But what I want to do is tell you who is Superior today. Superior today is a globally diversified oilfield service company with over 22 products and services around the world. We've got thousands of men and women who are operating in excess of 400 operations in excess of 30 countries around the world. The last 12 months, we've generated in excess of $4 billion of revenue, and one of the things of particular note is we've got a little over $1.1 billion in liquidity, and in this market, that's not a bad problem to have, having some liquidity and assurance on your balance sheet, which, as you'll see, might allow us to be a little bit offensive in this downturn, not really necessarily a reaction to where we are in commodity prices. That's Superior today, so before I move forward, what I might do is take a step back and try and give you an impression of how we got here. So in the 1980s, a man named Terry Hall had an idea. And Terry saw a lot of the large service companies migrating in a direction of higher technology, deeper, jazzier wells, and felt that a large portion of the market globally was underserved. And really that market consists of roughly more or less 70% of all the fields around the world, about 45% of all the reservoirs around the world are what we would call a mid or lower tier, which doesn't need the requisite high technology or deep water capital expenditure investment. It's kind of the nuts and bolts, everyday type of wells. And so what Terry did is he saw a void there, and he endeavored to find entrepreneurs who had a sense of practical innovation to address the needs and solutions of a lot of our customers around the world. So he went on an acquisition tear, and he hired some individuals who had similar perspective as Terry, and he let them or gave them a license to do what they do best, and that's run their businesses. Not too dissimilar to what you all are doing today. Entrepreneurial, practically innovative solutions, not necessarily the fanciest whiz-bang out there, but things that work. They function, and they're needed by our customers in 30 or 40 countries around the world. And so in doing so, they're going to continue to be entrepreneurs, and they're going to be underpinned by Superior's back office, our HR, our IT, our infrastructure, and allow them to go, as I mentioned, do what they do best. We built our portfolio. We're predominantly a production-related services. We amorphosized into exposure to the wellbore, as well as in wellbore construction and the completion side of the house. Later in the 1990s, we issued shares on the NASDAQ and ultimately on the New York Stock Exchange. And at the turn of the century, we put our first toe in the international waters. And in 2000, we acquired a company that's actually based here in Arnoldville, Louisiana, called ISS. It's a hydraulic workover and snubbing company. while they were based here, they had a large, or the lion's share of their operation was in Australia and working for ESSO, and I'm proud to say that 25 years later, they're still working for ESSO, which is good and bad, I guess. That was really our first foray, and then over the ensuing 14 years, we went on an 8 acquisition expansion effort internationally, which you can see some of the brands that we've acquired. Most recently, the one on the far right, E&I, we acquired in October of last year, which is an Indian-based well services business. As a result of such, you can see also in 2000, our international revenue was 0. And 2014, we exited the year at 16% of our total global revenue was outside of North America. So that said, in 2010, we hired Dave Dunlap, who is our current Chief Executive Officer. Prior to that, he was head of international at BJ Services. And then from there, he was a Chief Operating Officer. As we all know, BJ Services was acquired by Baker Hughes, and he then came over to be our CEO. And you can also notice in 2010, about roughly, it's not shown there, but 27% of our revenue was outside of North America and international, and you'll see it's actually gone down. And so if you were in my job, normally looking at it like this, you'd probably get worried about job security if revenue is starting to shrink versus versus expand. But what we did is in 2012, we acquired a U.S. pressure pumper and about a $3 billion acquisition. So as a percentage of our global revenue, our international component was smaller, but our total revenue was larger. And the impetus for this transaction was because not only did it give us some incremental product lines, but it also gave us the balance sheet, and it gave us the breadth and scale to continue international expansion, which is something that I'll talk about in a minute. So pretty large. We're the 5th largest diversified service company in the world right now. Hopefully, if the Halliburton-Baker Hughes deal goes through, then we'll now be the 4th largest in the world. And that brings us up really to modern times. So that's who we are. That's where we are. So where are we going? And how does this relate to our discussion? You can see our core strategy at Superior really is to take all the innovation and assets and capital, which I'll talk about, that have been derived over the last 20 some odd years in North America and export that internationally. In doing so, our strategy really doesn't change, though, and our strategy is to target mature and growing markets. Notice I didn't say stable, because not, unfortunately, all the markets in which we participate are stable. But large and growing mature markets are where we make our money. We have a balanced approach, and this manifests itself not only geographically, but also from a product diversification, as well as from a customer portfolio. It's an old commonsensical type of thing. You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket, and that really resonates internationally. Tactically, we have grown our business through acquisitions. As I've mentioned, we've confected 8 of them since 2000, but also organically. And also our product line through acquisition has helped delever some of the risk. So when you go to a market, you've got a lot of working capital concerns that you've got to invest in to build out your international business, but an acquisition can somehow and oftentimes mitigate that because you've got an earning stream that's coming on board. And we continue to focus on a low-cost structure. So we're growing. We've got pretty good concentration and good traction internationally. Our strategy is large, growing, mature markets. And so as we see the future, how do we project moving forward from here? Well, we think it's, as I mentioned, a balanced execution. If you look at how we look at the world since 2010 through exiting 2014, we've grown our 8 out of 22 core product lines, 71% on the top line. It's pretty big growth. It's the biggest in the industry, frankly. Sometimes we've been really smart in how we've done it, and other times we haven't been so smart, and I'll share some of those stories with you as well. But we think over the next 5 to 10 years, we're anticipating in excess of 10% annual average revenue growth. And you can see really the lighter shaded, the dark shades represent the countries in which we operate today. The lighter shades are also countries in which we operate today. However, the lighter shaded ones are going to be more representative of those 8 core countries that we think that there's going to be faster paced growth than the pre-existing countries and operations we have now. So that notwithstanding, there's some things that I'd impart or ask you to consider when you think about going internationally. And I don't want to sound like the Grim Reaper in some of these comments, but I really do want to be a realist. And you really, I think, need to think about how time-consuming and how potentially financially draining going internationally is. It is a bear. We've been trying, as I mentioned, since 2000, and 14 years later, only 16% of our revenue is outside of North America. There are a lot of landmines. And one of the strategies that we've enveloped is, and Jim touched upon it, is finding a river guide. What happens oftentimes when U.S. companies are trying to go internationally is they take U.S. individuals to go start up an operation. I highly recommend you not doing that. Now, there's certain back office things that you're going to want to consider, whether it's finance or accounting or some technology, but internationally is about local relationships. Having that parochial boot on the ground is germane to success. So I call them river guides. Imagine yourself traveling down a river, and in that river there are a lot of sandbars, and there might be a stump that's sticking out of the water. Well, these nationals know where those estuaries are to take, or where the deepest part of the channel is to navigate, far more than somebody coming out of Houston or New Orleans or Lafayette. I promise you. I promise you. And I'll give you a perfect example. Several years ago in Argentina, the government, led by the soon-to-be ex-president Cristina Kirchner, decided that they were going to nationalize YPF, which is now the nationally owned oil company in Argentina. A lot of headline press, very negative sentiment throughout the international investment community, a lot of people scratching their heads. And as a result of such, she brought in a CEO named Miguel Galucho. Miguel was a long-term Schlumberger engineer. And it just so happened that our vice president of Latin America is a guy named Carlos Servo. Carlos Servo today is still our vice president of Latin America. And Carlos and Miguel were cubicle mates, if you will, at Schlumberger. They were engineers together, sitting side by side, shoulder by shoulder. They're both Argentinian. That's a relationship I'll never be able to recreate. I could spend the rest of my life in Buenos Aires, traveling through Patagonia, trying to catch a fish like Mary on a bus. I could literally dedicate my entire life to developing and establishing relationships in Argentina. I'll never replicate that. Carlos is one of our river guides. He's been operating that market for 33 years. He was at Schlumberger for 28. Subsequent to Schlumberger, he was at Baker Hughes for 7. His last job was head of all pressure pumping services at Baker Hughes. This man knows that market, and this is that river guide that I mentioned. So there's a whole laundry list of things up here. I'm not going to bore you or insult you by going through every single one of them, but I really put them into 4 broad categories, and I'll try and leave you with 4 things to think about if you don't remember anything else. But there are extreme variances in each country. There are political, regulatory, cultural, fiscal, different customers, different climates, different geographies, terrain. It is not like going to West Texas or Louisiana. You've got to account for everything. On one day, you may put in a big pressure pumping frac fleet in the New Ken Basin. The other, you may be helicoptering coiled tubing in the Amazon jungle. It's very different. You know, one of the funny things is also it's trying to get your mind around the fact that in some instances you're working in different climates. We have a pick on our HSCQ guy all the time because every summer he sends out a hot weather bulletin saying that, you know, make sure you hydrate, make sure you stay in the shade, make sure you don't get too overheated. And oftentimes I'll respond with a cheeky response saying, you realize we have 3,000 people working in the southern hemisphere right now where it's 14 degrees. So you might want to think about sending a cold weather bulletin. My point is, psychologically, you've got to position yourself and condition yourself thinking about things are different. You are not in Louisiana, you're not in Texas. I know it sounds obvious, but it's true. And trying to invoke the Western mentality and an Eastern hemisphere doesn't work. And it's something I would strongly consider you to consider. Finance, you want to make sure you've got a robust capability. These are not day rate utilization call-out contracts that you're working on internationally. They're long-term. Tremendous investment up front required. Not all of them go as planned. Many of them don't go as planned, so you've got to have the ability to absorb those that don't go as planned. Brazil's a great example. 3 years ago, raise your hand if you thought Brazil was going to be in the quagmire they're in now. A lot of you probably say, well, I knew, and it's Brazil, but a lot of people didn't, and a lot of people are hemorrhaging severely in Brazil because they placed a bet on the pre-salt and they thought that 55 rigs were going to be in Brazil right now. They're about 10, and that's probably going to 0. Things change. Like in life, things change. Internationally, they change more so than in the United States. Contracting. Contracting is key. And within contracting, because you have a contract doesn't mean you have a contract. So it's very important to understand that a lot of these contracts aren't worth the paper they're written on. When YPF or Pertamina or Petronas or Saudi Aramco wants to come talk about things, they're going to come talk about it. And now you're at a decision point. You're either going to continue to talk about it or you're not. Either way, it's probably a challenging situation, but understand that because you have a contract doesn't mean you have one. Also, along those lines, over 90% of the world's oil and gas reserves are controlled by a government, a nationally owned oil company. And that's important to remember. So remember, that's your customer. So when there are contractual issues, remember that your counterparty is a government. Oftentimes, I've heard some of our operators say, well, let's just sue them. That sounds very brave, but who's going to raise their hand and say, well, I go sue the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? It doesn't exactly work that way. So you just need to take those things into consideration. Again, finance, contracting, the operations, and I won't read through all these, but I think 4 things that I would like for you to think about is against the balance sheet. Make sure your balance sheet is ready to do this. It doesn't have to necessarily be big. It has to be stable, it has to be flexible, and it has to be capable of providing sufficient working capital, but again, also weathering any downstorms or storm clouds that may come in the way as a result of the opportunity just not working out as you had planned. Because you never, or oftentimes don't get to have a contract, then go build the equipment. You need to have it ready to go. And so these contracts, oftentimes internationally, aren't always small. They might be several $100 million contracts, and you might have $20, $30, $50, $100 million type expenditure. I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying be prepared for it. Be prepared to invest ahead of opportunity. One of the big mistakes that Superior's made leading up to 2000 when we tried to go international is we'd run around the world with our business cards and we'd have our clothes on and we'd tell everybody that we're Superior and we're coming international. And not one company knew who we were. Not one company cared who we were. And frankly, I don't blame them. I wouldn't have either. And we went there and said, we've got all these interesting tools and toys and give us a contract and we'll bring them. And again, they said, who are you? Show us your yard. Show us your quality management system. Show us your head count. Show us your HSEQ program. Show us your equipment. Show me 10 years of demonstrated work in coiled tubing in Kuwait. 10 years. To go to Kuwait, you got to have 10 years of experience doing it. It's kind of like trying to get a job when you don't have experience and trying to get experience when you don't have a job. It's challenging. So that's why oftentimes I would suggest you pick large, mature, growing markets. A lot of areas where companies stub their toes, they go to Russia. Mexico can oftentimes be challenging. I don't want to necessarily, it's always challenging, but it can be challenging because there's a lot of volatility there. Not only politically, but there's also volatility in the way that they operate, not meaning specific to Mexico, but some countries. So what I would suggest is you look for large, mature, relatively stable, growing markets. Along those lines, FCPA, I know the mayor's going to talk about it, it's real. FCPA and compliance are real. The laws are real. The licenses are real. The local content requirements are real. Indonesia's got this special MIT black box that you got to somehow figure out what the local content rules are, and every time you figure it out, you think you figure it out, they change it. And so trying to work in Indonesia, then they have all these different, who has more equity in the operating entity or the legal entity, and what statutory books can you demonstrate to us, and do you have positive equity balance? Because if you take too much money out and you have an equity balance, you're blackballed for 10 years, on and on and on and on. It's like drinking through a fire hose. It really is. And I still feel like at times I'm drinking through a fire hose because every country is different. In the United States, it's easy. You go set up an LLC, and you go ahead and get your business license, and you get your operating license, or your hazardous material license, or whatever the license you may need, and you go ahead and check in with all the authorities, and you put a little capital on the balance sheet, and off you go. Get a job. And actually, it's really different. It really is. And look, again, I'm not trying to scare you. What I'm trying to do is just make you aware, because I've made a lot of mistakes doing this, and I've stubbed more than my toe, and I'm hoping that you don't stub your toe if this is something that is of interest to you. 3 other things I'd suggest. 1 would be strong balance sheet. Secondly would be is diversification in your product offering. Dave Dunlap, as I mentioned, our CEO was at BJ Services when he was running internationally, and he had the fortune or misfortune of having 3 products. And he just assumed that every country needs your products, when in reality, some countries are just getting started, and they're focused more on wellbore construction. Some are 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old oil fields, and they got long-lived assets, and they need a lot of well intervention, whether it's coiled tubing or slick line or go pump some nitrogen or whatever that may be. Some are in the completion phase. So just because you have coiled tubing doesn't mean they need coiled tubing. Just because you have a jar doesn't mean that a jar is needed in that country. So one of the benefits of Superior is we've got over 20 product lines, and that allows us to put a round peg into a round hole, not a square peg into a round hole. So it brings a lot of different capabilities to a lot of different markets, which is beneficial. So I would say that's something you ought to consider as well. Choose your countries wisely. I won't belabor that point. I think we've talked about it, but the pre-qualification can be overwhelming. We just submitted a tender for a pre-qualification document for one of our product lines in Kuwait. It was 1,600 pages long. I'm not kidding. And you got to have it digitally, and you got to have it stamped, and you got to have it notarized, and you got to have, the Holy Grail bless it, and it's got to be, it's got to be at a certain degree from the sun when you take a picture of it. I mean, it's unbelievable the wikis you got to go through. But that's one document. Now, amortize that over 2, 3, 4, 20, 30, 40 countries. Think of the infrastructure required to fill that out. Think of the quality management systems. Our quality management system alone is 900 pages long. A lot of nationally owned oil companies are more, the old saying, nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM. Well, that holds true internationally. They're oftentimes looking for this bespoke brand, regardless of if they're the best one, the most efficient one, the most cost effective. But remember, you're dealing oftentimes with government employees. And so there's a lot of job preservation here versus creation. And so just keep that in mind, that you're dealing with a different customer base. So strong balance sheet, financial capability, diversified product offering, I strongly suggest. Choose your countries wisely. And then lastly, I'd say patience. Patience is a virtue. It's true here. We've spent gobs amount of money in certain markets, and I don't have a dollar to show in revenue right now. We will, but we don't now. You gotta, there's an old saying, scared money don't make money. You've got to be prepared to invest in head of opportunity. Because take it from me, when Superior used to go around our little suitcases and saying, Superior, here we come, but we need a contract to do that. It's a very, very short meeting. I won't bore you with everything. I'm going to be here for a while. I'm happy to entertain any. I think we're going to have questions after this. Yeah.
I think Jeff's going to hold the questions. I think it'd be great.
After, but take it from me, I am more than capable of explaining how to make mistakes, expanding business internationally. So if you care to hear about how to make mistakes and then you can turn your brain and not make those same mistakes, I'm happy to help. Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Well, after Westy played the Grim Reaper, I do have a very large person at the door, so you don't leave. He made it sound very difficult, and it is, and hopefully you understood that when I actually began to introduce our speakers. International business is a very challenging, time-consuming, and expensive process. And I think that our next speaker can speak to some of that, because Eduardo Borja is not only a very, very dear friend of mine, he's a former colleague of mine when I was with Global Industries. We were an offshore construction company. And just as Wesley said, we went to Mexico with our suitcase and said, we're Global Industries, here we are. Well, they had already had their brand selected. They were already working with a company called McDermott International, who was their favorite player. And we had no clue as to what the issues we were going to be confronted with. And we were just fortunate enough to be able to find Eduardo Borja. Eduardo has over 35 years experience in several aspects of infrastructure sectors such as strategic planning, business development, acquisitions, project coordination, and project management. Mr. Borja worked at ICA, which is in Mexico, for 21 years, where he held several executive positions. In 2001, he joined Global Industries as Director of Business Development for Mexico. And then later, of course, he became our Executive Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Planning until the merger of Global with Technip USA in 2011. He has several key achievements, which I'm very proud to say, in his workings with Global Industries, and that is restructuring of our Mexico operation. And he did revamp and restructure us into a profitable center there in Mexico. He positioned our company as a preferred offshore provider for Pemex and pipe laying and hookup work in the Bay of Campeche, and later establishing our branch in Brazil and Argentina. He joined Marcos and Associates as partner of the consulting firm there with his main focus on the energy sector and is an active participant to the board of directors of several companies, Swiber Offshore, Neuro Services, Harkand Arena, SIP, and of course all Arena companies. Mr. Borja is a founding partner of Arena. He holds a degree in civil engineering from the University of Mexico, master's study from the University of Iberoamericana in Mexico. He holds a certificate of seminars and some courses, of course, in IPADA, and of course he attended Harvard University as well in some of the management programs that our company had there. He will speak to us today about Mexico. He's going to talk some more in the event that you were in yesterday's seminar on Mexico, some about what's happening there with reform. Westy was very good at stating something. Pemex is a state-owned oil company. They're the government. There are a lot of times these governments will tell us everything we want to know, or want to hear, not know, want to hear. Eduardo, of course, is going to tell us everything he knows about how to do business in Mexico. He's going to share some of those, not only what's happening in Mexico today, but some of the challenging aspects that you may be confronted with in working in that country. I want to personally thank Eduardo and his wife, Monica, made the trip here to travel from Mexico on our own dollars and cents as a personal favor for me, and then drove in from Houston as well. We had dinner last night. But thank you guys for coming from Mexico on your own nickel. That tells you and me what a friend he really is. Mr. Eduardo Borja, thank you. No, can't get there. Let me go back over here. Yeah, it's on the screen.
There it is.
And you should be here. Get you here.
Well, good morning, buenos días. I was given the idea of giving this speech in Spanish, but I think it was unfair. This is, it's an honor for me to be here this morning and sharing this panel with Mary, with whom I have had exciting stories in South America in the past and also in Mexico, Westy, and obviously with Jim. He and I have worked for a long time, and I would say this was like my professional honeymoon, having worked for Global. Arena, who we are? We are a company that does projects. We do project coordination. We assist companies interested in Mexico to establish in country. We have several, the group is conformed of several companies. We're in the real estate business. We're also in the infrastructure business. As of today, we are actually project coordinators of 2 airport terminals, the only ones that are being built in the country, in Cancun, Terminal 3 and Terminal 4. Whoever has traveled to Cancun has used that terminal. And in the oil and gas business, we have been working with several companies who established in Mexico. The most relevant one as of today is Williams. Williams decided to go and explore opportunities in Mexico as a result of the energy reform. And today we have a very hot project, which is a pipeline that goes from Houston down to Tuxpan, Mexico. It's a 648-inch pipeline that we're chasing as partners with Williams. So, to give you a bit of a background first, I'm Mexican, born and raised in Mexico, educated there. My father was a visionary, I think. At some point when I was at the age of 13, he decided to send me to Germany. So I was in an interchange program over there for 3 years throughout high school. And in those days, it's early 70s. It was really hard to travel there. I believe that he was understanding that things were going to change and that the frontiers were no longer going to be as they were in those days. To me, that was really a positive thing. I understood what is required to be multicultural, to understand what is required to also understand mentality, foreign mentality, and how to adapt that adapted to my country. So when I returned, this is when once I was introduced to Bill Doré, James' brother. He had issues in Mexico, and he was advised to talk to me. He and I got along well, so we decided to join. And this became an interesting journey, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Going back to the presentation, what I'm going to be talking about is a general overview, the economic behavior of Mexico, focusing on Mexico versus emerging markets, the oil and gas situation, which I understand was covered by the Mexican executives who were visiting LAGCOE, and then a little bit about strategy. Economic behavior. NAFTA. The North American Free Trade Agreement is already 21 years old, and that has really reshaped the economic scenario of, I would say, the three countries, beginning with Mexico, the US, and Canada. Canada, I would say, a little behind us, but they're still there. What has happened ever since? A lot, and I'll show you. There's another big factor to consider, the long-term offshore investment program that is underway for Mexico, not only onshore, but also not only offshore, but also onshore. And LAGCOE associates are in close proximity to Pemex's offshore infrastructure. So that's an asset. That's something you guys need to look at and consider. The chart on the left shows the GDP growth path of both the United States and Mexico. The United States is the red bar and Mexico is the green one. When we see a lot of similarities between them. Maybe we have peaks and valleys that are more, that are steeper. But in all, over the last 15 years, we have experienced a 2.3 average growth rate, which is quite similar to the US. Then there's a correlation of economic activity between Latin American countries versus the US. The average is 0.51, that's a correlation of economic activity. And you get to see Mexico is 82. So what happened? Back in year 2000, not even that, in 1994, when NAFTA was implemented, we were an oil-driven economy. 70% of our GDP was relying on Pemex, one single company. As of today, it's only 30% of GDP. What has happened? The economy has changed. As a result of NAFTA, we have a stronger industry, especially in automotive, in the auto industry. We also have a stronger industry in the assembly plants that are established in the border, and also tourism. So today, oil represents 30% of our GDP. Now, the energy reform is coming, and the energy reform is now going to allow for Mexico to continue growing at a higher path, and maybe the oil sector will have a bigger portion of the growth rate. With regards to government debt, 2 years ago, Mexico was graded by Moody's. The investment grade is A3, which is really an accomplishment. And this is a result of the reforms that were implemented. When we get to see this, we can see Brazil, as you just stated. Brazil has 59% of the government debt, is 59% of their GDP. Malaysia, 53. Ours is 33, only behind Chile. Recently, we've seen a slowdown in the economy, and that is also forcing for the exchange rate to shift. The red bar is Mexico, and this chart is, the purpose is to compare Mexico with Colombia and Brazil, who have been the stars of the emerging market, the Latin American markets. Colombia and Brazil have lost almost 40% of their value versus the dollar, whereas we're in the 25% range. But that is only increasing our revenue base through the auto industry and tourism. As to oil and gas, yesterday I understand the reform was presented to you by the government officials. This chart is a summary of how companies need to deal with business in Mexico as a result of reform. In the past, we used to have a monopoly controlled by Pemex. Now the CFE. CFE is a power electric company, state-owned company too, and they happen to be the largest promoter of gas pipelines in Mexico, both onshore and offshore. Mexico's electricity depends on natural gas. 70% of Mexico electricity comes from national gas, and we're hungering for it. So this gas is coming from the U.S. So the infrastructure that is being promoted today is to allow for that gas to come in. When a company is entering Mexico, we'll have to deal with the Minister of Energy, with the National Hydrocarbons Commission, who will be the one who manages contracts, permits through the Regulatory Commission. Obviously, environmental and protection agencies are to be also attended and observed, and to have a close interface with the public, the national companies, Pemex and CFE. As a result, there were several rounds. The process of the reform is calling for rounds for awards of blocks. Round 0 was exclusively selected and reserved for Pemex. Pemex was awarded almost 90% of the current assets. Pemex had the opportunity also has the opportunity to enter into subsequent rounds if it is of their interest. And they have a mandate to establish joint ventures for exploration and development of deep water fields or new fields. On round 1, as I mentioned, Pemex may participate, IOCs can participate by themselves. National contact is an issue. 25% is required as of today, and the expectation is to increase that up to 35%. And the state will evaluate whatever offer is there that will bring the most convenient advantages to the country, and they will select them. 45 companies have participated on round 1, and they come from all over the world. You get to see Asian companies, European companies, American companies, and South American companies as well. The ones who have been awarded with blocks are the ones that are here: Sierra Oil and Gas, Talos, Premier Oil in first round. On this first round, there were 15 blocks for bid, for tender, and only 2 were assigned. Why is that? There were some legal restrictions that public companies did not accept. So on the next round, Pemex and the government made changes to those legal requirements, and and the result is that out of the 5 blocks that were out for bid, 3 were awarded to Eni, Pan American, and Fieldwood. The green blocks depict where the production is coming from. Aside from the deep water ones, which are on the top right, the rest is where the blocks are being assigned. Round 1 is calling for several blocks in the onshore area of Chicontepec, and in the south, where we see the biggest blocks. This is shallow waters, and some blocks were already assigned there. And the rounds will keep on coming up. Pemex is actively amending contracts and seeking for investors to be attracted to these fields. You see a remark I must say: what is the need of building walls between countries? If we're compliant, if we are in compliance with the laws, we have an interface, a transparent relationship between countries. Those walls are not needed as long as we're compliant. The $2.4 million of barrels that Mexico is producing come 50% from offshore fields. Cantarell, which is depleting dramatically, Comalopsap, and they're reserved for Pemex. The rest of the pipe, the lower part, is where the blocks, where the government is allowing for private investment to enter into. Pemex, after the energy reform, is facing issues and challenges. The energy reform is forcing for Pemex to have competition. They will no longer be a monopoly. They're also under pressure to perform, and Pemex needs also to understand that they now will have to work under budget restrictions, more stringent ones. Shallow waters is the home turf of Pemex, but they will have to seek for the right partner for growth. Administrative and execution difficulties, which is a misalignment between the organization. It's a very, very big organization. They're trimming it, so it is taking time. And a reality, government institutions and Mexican government institutions are weakened by corruption. We have seen a lot, we have heard a lot about that. There's a scandal like the Oceanografia, which is a major contractor from Mexico. At some time, at a point in time, they had almost 100 vessels chartered with Pemex, and they went bankrupt, and their executives are today in jail. So IOCs and service providers should be prepared to avoid getting involved in that. I think that throughout my history in the past with Global, what we did right is precisely that, to seek the right advice and always take action along with our experts in compliance. On strategy, in establishing in Mexico, the first thing we need to do, and this is very consistent to what Westy was saying, achieve full understanding of the local market, oil and gas industry, have a clear view of the market conditions, assess the market size, market niches, competitors, and the country requirements, which is really the most relevant one. The importance of local content is something foreign companies wanting to establish in Mexico should observe. Understanding the customer, become familiarized with the customer. In this case, I'm still going to talk about Pemex because they will remain as the strongest company in Mexico for the next 2 years. Become familiarized with them. They're one of the largest oil companies in the world. Pemex is going through a transformation process, and they need help. If we are there, if we want to provide solutions, identify those requirements, specific requirements of Pemex, and consider deploying technical capabilities or assets into country. With that, then figure out the value creation offer of each company. In the offshore market particularly, the most active segments are pipelay, IMR, transportation and installation, decommissioning and drilling. And focus on one, depending on the core business of the company, and then develop the relationship with the local supply chain. As Westy would say, it's not wise to come in with a business offer, an isolated one, and trying to get introduced to the market independently. It's always best to develop a network, a local network. With that, closing the gap would be develop local talent management. The best thing you can do is have someone local represent you. So, in summary, what I would suggest is do the homework whenever going to a foreign country. First, identify the opportunities. Seek local advice. Obtain a general overview of and understand of the current issues which are there today. Learn who the stakeholders are and develop a 12 to 18-month action plan. This is an aggressive one. The intention of this one is to suggest the establishment of a local branch. In 12 to 18 months, a decision would be made for a company interested in accessing Mexico and whether they would like to have a local branch established. And also establish a connection with local stakeholders. So, in summary, this is what I would suggest for you to observe, and I'm open for any questions you might have. Thank you.
That didn't work. If I can exit from this. I mean, your help to exit from exit. Oh, you can still see that, I guess. Actually, I thought I had it much larger than that. Eduardo, thank you a lot for your comments. And of course, as always, it's a pleasure to have you talk about Mexico and some of the things that you know and obviously understand quite well. You know, Eduardo touched on some of the issues that we have in foreign countries. It isn't just Mexico, but it's all about having the proper compliance and making sure that we have the ability to protect our companies. Very few people, in particular smaller companies, I find, really understand that we all have to follow compliance. It isn't simply, if you're a public company, that you need to be aware of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. it actually applies to each and every one of us in business. Small, large, mid-size, it makes no difference. I might need some help trying to make this, I see it in my peripheral vision, it keeps flipping, so can I have you to help me, please? While we're waiting for a little help, so because I think I screwed this up by accepting that invitation. Let me introduce another very good friend of mine, and Eduardo's, of course, who I hadn't had the opportunity to work as closely with as I had Eduardo, because I was in the corporate office in Houston. Mary had boots on the ground in Carlos, Louisiana, which is where the real operations took place. But the thing that I remember most is that we had an issue in West Africa where we were basically accused, I guess, of foreign corrupt practices issues, and Mary and her team stepped to the table and probably spent 1.5 years, 2 years defending our company, in which, of course, we had no wrongdoing in the first place. But it took us, 2 years, maybe several millions of dollars defending our company of something that we had no reference to, which was quite interesting. So Mary's going to talk some to that. But Mary Shattuck Jones has practiced law for 28 years in Texas and Louisiana, primarily in the international marine and oil services industries. She was the first woman to earn TRACE, Anti-Bribery Specialist Accreditation, TASA. TSA developed by the global anti-corruption, anti-bribery nonprofit TRACE International is the first anti-bribery compliance accreditation program. Prior to opening her law firm, Ms. Jones served as the Assistant General Counsel and Director of Insurance and Compliance for Global Industries Limited, where she assisted the company in successfully exiting from an internal Foreign Corrupt Practices Act investigation with no action from either Department of Justice or the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was a huge feat for us because, as you can imagine, when you have our own government coming after you, they come in droves. And Mary and her team, and I still remember seeing the photograph of her home where she had her dining room table just filled with binders responding to that allegation. Ms. Jones has extensive experience in creating and designing compliance programs to reduce the risks of such violations, including policies and procedures, educational and training materials and programs, contract provisions, and due diligence protocols. She implements and works with in-house counsel and compliance vendors to execute compliance policies and training programs tailored to the client's business structure and the market conditions in the client's target countries. Of course, she will present the keys to conducting international business, specifically with respect to Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and compliance. She's also the author of Compliance Matters, as you see. I think you have that on your table. I'm sure she'll be here to answer any of your questions and will be available to assist companies. I applaud her desire and her energy toward working with small companies, of which Global was several years ago. But she gets it. She understands that all of us need help and assistance in growing our companies, and we also need to have someone running interference for us out front. So, Mary, welcome to the podium.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate it. My presentation is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to try to see if I can move this over, because I want to talk to you. I did prepare an edition of Compliance Matters specifically for companies that were going to be at LAGCOE. So rather than have a PowerPoint that I'm going through, I think it's important that we have an opportunity to kind of walk through what a compliance program is, what are some of the issues, and what are some of the real life scenarios that I have seen with various companies that I've worked for. So, compliance is you've got all kinds. You've got health and safety compliance. You've got regulatory compliance. What I'm talking about at this point in time is generally focusing on your compliance areas around anti-bribery, antitrust, export control, those types of regulatory compliance from a United States, primarily from a U.S. standpoint. When a company is going international, it opens up a whole new set of regulations that you've really never encountered before, because you're dealing now in the transportation of goods overseas, or to Mexico or Canada. You are dealing with foreign governments, especially in the oil and gas industry. Most of the countries that we are operating in have government-owned oil and gas companies. So you're really dealing with a very different perspective when you deal internationally. You also have the issue in many countries, especially in the developing countries. Perhaps that's not even fair. Perhaps it's in most international countries. You have the government owns so much of the infrastructure that from the time you try to get your visa to be able to walk into the country, to be able to get a permit to bring a vessel in, to get a contract be awarded, and then have to have subcontracts with local contractors. You're dealing at every step of the way with a government official. And the biggest challenge is under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But I want to, before kind of going into the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for you, I'm going to find out kind of what the level of knowledge is. But the first thing that you need to think about when you go into a international country is, what's your risk profile? You know, I used to scratch my head when I would say, you know, because the government says you need to do a risk assessment every year, and I just kind of scratch my head and think, what does that mean? I mean, that just seems so complicated, and it can be complicated, but it doesn't have to be. The real key, in my opinion, has always been to have a group of experts sit around the table, not for days and days and days and days, sit down and talk about, what are we going to do? What are our operations? Who are our customers? What's our goal? And then from a legal standpoint, I would have it facilitated by your legal department, be able to say, okay, now, if we're going to go into Brazil, we know that we have to have certain licenses in order to be able to do, to bring our vessels or our ROVs, our binoculars or different things into Brazil. We need to know what the export laws are. We need to make certain that when we are dealing with the marine business, especially with vessels, it's very difficult in Brazil because you have to first use Brazilian flagged vessels. Well, most U.S. companies don't have Brazilian flagged vessels. So you are having to go through the process again of determining how to get your vessel to be approved in Brazil. It's a very long process. But you want to start all of this at the beginning before you go in. And I also would say that when you start a new project, it never hurts to go back to the beginning to look at what your goals are, what are the legal and regulatory risks, and then what actions do you need to take in order to mitigate those risks. So you see on page 2, on page 2 of the Compliance Matters, you know, I've kind of given just a brief overview of what I looked at from a risk assessment. So then once you kind of know what your exposures are, you need to have a good compliance program. And you know, it could be for a good compliance program is kind of the umbrella. You're going to have certain rules and regulations that are going to be different, but your overall compliance program is fairly simple and it's standard. The very first thing is you have to have a tone at the top. And you know, I realized that early on. I worked for Hollywood Marine, which was at that time owned by Bird and Lawrence. And he is one of the most ethical men I've ever met. And he would roam around the halls at Hollywood Marine, and he was always looking at things very positively. And the tone at the top really does matter. If you've got executives, or even if you've got, executives or middle-level managers who aren't consistently giving the message that we're going to do it the right way, then people aren't going to do it the right way because they think it's okay. You could have a compliance program in place that says we're going to act ethically and with the highest degree of integrity. But if you're not modeling that behavior, then clearly those who are following your lead are not going to believe that that's something that is really of value and importance. So I do stress that all of you in leadership positions maintain the highest degree of ethics and integrity. That's something you once you lose people's trust, once you lose your, the perception that you are ethical and that you have a high degree of integrity, it's really hard to claw that back. It'll take you a long time. So be a good role model. Second thing is you want to make sure that you have good policies and procedures. You don't have to have a policy and procedure manual that is, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long, because frankly, people won't read them if they're that long. What you're looking for is for policies that are integrated and are very, very easy to read. Take all the legalese out of it. If you're going to have a policy on gifts and entertainment, you don't have to go into a whole lot of legalese on why you have to have it. People don't really care, do they? They want to know what's the rules. Help me know the rules, and then I can follow them. If I don't understand the rules, then I'm not going to be able to follow them. And, then if I get fired, I'm going to be ticked off, and because you didn't give me good rules. Have good policies and procedures. Then make sure people understand those policies and procedures by doing training. I started Compliance Matters writing this at Global Industries, and it was a one-page, front and back, and I would send it out about once a month, and it was for topical issues. We would talk about all kinds of things. Everything from, antitrust. When we got around OTC or LAGCOE, I made sure that people understood that it's not okay to get into a room and say, all right, I'm going to take this job and you're going to bid this job, and that's a win-win for both of us. Well, no, that's against the law. You can't collaborate to reduce competition. But when people talk about antitrust, all of their eyeballs start to go roll back into the back of your heads. But it's very important that you understand collaboration among industry is good, but no collaboration can take away the competition, which is what really drives the market. We want competition. So I would give one presentation on antitrust. And then, the next month I would have it on gifts and entertainment around the holidays, both giving gifts and receiving gifts. Because even even if you're not looking at it from an FCPA standpoint, if you're just talking about gifts and entertainment, you don't want, as a vendor, I don't think you want to have to buy you don't want to have to have your product or your service bought just simply because you can give someone great tickets to the football game, right? It's important for long-term sustainability of any company that you can rely on your products and your service. So don't devalue your company by trying to basically win by giving gifts or entertainment, because that's a very short-lived, and people start to expect that. So, you know, and so when you know, at certain times, it's important for your employees to be able to understand, you know, little bits. You know, one of the first companies that I ever went to work for, the second day, I got the legal talk, and I was in the legal department, and it was on the code of conduct, and it was one day, and a lawyer sat there and droned on and on and on and on and on and on about things that by the time at the end of the day, even being a lawyer, I had no clue what they had said. I was so tired, and you can just get saturated. So one of the things that I encourage companies to do is to give compliance issues in small doses on a regular basis. And that in the, I don't want to go into cases too much, but there was a Morgan Stanley case where they had allegations against the FCPA, and that was one of the things that was the most beneficial to Morgan Stanley individually. Now, the individual was prosecuted, but Morgan Stanley as a company was able to show that it had an effective compliance program, that it was not just a paper product that was on the shelf, that it was a living, breathing document. And as a result of being able to show the various trainings, it actually had the best result you could ask for. One of the things that Jim indicated that Global went through was we went through an FCPA investigation, and I worked on that for 2.5 years. There's no way that I could get a better education than actually going through that process. I'll tell you, little intimidates me, but sitting in Washington, D.C. around a very long table, having the Department of Justice, Securities and Exchange Commission, and the FBI, and myself and the general counsel and 2 lawyers was frightening. It is not an experience that you want to go through. And it's very easy to violate the FCPA. It really is. It's very easy, and people violate it all the time, not realizing that they're violating it. So I want to spend just a moment talking about the FCPA, but before I do that, I wanted to find out how many of you are familiar with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? Most of you, okay. So in a nutshell, right, it prohibits the giving, offering, authorizing, payment, promising of pay, anything of value to a foreign government official, foreign in the terms of non-U.S., for the purpose of obtaining or retaining business or getting any other business advantage. Now, that's a fairly precise discussion or explanation of the law. The problem is that if you take a rubber band and it's, you know, it's just regular, the rubber band's about like this, right? You can stretch a rubber band out to here. And that's unfortunately what the Department of Justice and the SEC have done with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's become extremely difficult to do business internationally and not violate the FCPA. It can be done even if you have violations. The key is making sure that you have a process that can identify, pick up when there's a problem, and then rectify it. You don't always have to go and report to the Department of Justice or the SEC that you have a violation. In fact, I wouldn't recommend that you go to the DOJ and the SEC every time you have a small violation. You really need to get good counsel on that. But what you want is for people to understand that law. So you want to be able to say, you want to go to your countries. It's critical. I will tell you, when the very first thing the Department of Justice asked me was, I want to see your code of conduct, I want to see your anti-corruption FCPA policy, I want to see your contract. And we were caught up in the Panalpina deal. I want to see your contract with Panalpina. I want to see your due diligence on Panalpina. I want to see your training in West Africa in different languages. I want to see your every single invoice that you've ever paid Panalpina in West Africa. And unfortunately, at that time, and I don't know, most of the accounting systems have really changed. This was in 2007. But we had a situation where the invoices would go to the person who had issued the PO. They checked it. They then kept the supporting documentation in their files and then just sent the approved invoice to AP for to be paid. So there was a disconnect when we had to go, when the government said, I want every single piece of paper, every invoice that you ever paid for Panalpina. Well, the accounting department, not realizing, sent just the invoices with no supporting documentation. That was a nightmare, because what ended up happening is I had to go back and that's what the binders were. I had to find every invoice, and then if an invoice had a fee for visas, if it had an invoice or a line item for the entry of a vessel, whatever it was, I had to then go to the various people in the, on the team, on the project team, to get the supporting documentation. So hopefully now most companies have it where their accounting systems are all digitalized and you can easily pull those things together. Why do I spend so much time on that? Because of this. According to the FCPA, there are two parts. One, the anti-bribery, and two, the books and records provision. The books and records provisions technically only applies to issuers, people who, companies that either are on the stock exchange or have to issue reports. But from a practical standpoint, it's very important to know that it's easier to show that you don't have a document, a supporting documentation, than it is to do a bribe. What do I mean? We had in Angola, we had our vessels come in and out, and they had port fees. And Angola had not been long out of a civil war. And so the port fees were not like they are in the United States, where you've got your tariffs and it's easy. Frankly, it was whatever kind of, what port wanted to charge at what time. So there wasn't a lot of supporting documentation. We had a big fight on that. Anytime you have equipment that comes into to a port, you're going to go to a trade-free zone, you have to have a police escort. And they would charge you, $10 or $15 for the police escort. I had the biggest fight ever with the Department of Justice and the SEC because I couldn't produce a little yellow slip of paper that said, was signed by the police officer. I literally had to go to Switzerland, to Panalpina, and go through nasty boxes to get one or two examples. And it ultimately cost our company $12.5 million in outside legal fees, not including the toll that it took on the company, but to get no fines and penalties. You look at what it costs to have an investigation. You don't want to do that. So make sure that you have a good solid compliance program. The other thing I want to briefly turn your attention to is export compliance, because that's one that is very difficult. I think that is one of the most difficult areas of the law. and again, one that doesn't have the highest profile of the FCPA, but clearly can have some devastating results. Anytime that you export, you transfer something out of the United States, and that can be by computer, be by telephone. It's not just shipping things. You have to know who your customer is. You have to know where it's going, who is the end user, what is the product. Is the product something that can be a dual use? I have to tell you, we had a situation where we got in trouble because we had an ROV that was attached to one of our vessels and we sent it to Brazil. The vessel was supposed to come back within a year, but for various reasons it didn't. And we got a letter from the Department of Commerce saying that we were in violation because we hadn't gotten the proper export permit for the ROV, which was part of the vessel. And I just thought, oh my God, I mean, I had no idea. And I had called, Vincent and Elkins in Washington and said, what is this about? And ROVs have certain imaging technologies that are considered dual use, and so they're restricted. And they've got an ECCN number that requires you to have a permit if it's going to be out of the United States for more than a year. We were very fortunate because I just pled stupidity, and it was the first time, and the Department of Commerce was great. I quickly learned a lot about export control over that. Be very cautious of that because very few companies, I feel, have a good grasp on it. 99% of products are not regulated, but a lot of our products are regulated. So make sure when you start sending things outside of the country that you know if they're regulated or if they're not. So I think it's about 11:15. I know we want to have time for some questions and answers, but anyway, hopefully you will get something out of this. It's not meant to give you all the answers. It's kind of a tickler to make sure that you think about these things when you're doing business internationally. So thank you very much.
The three speakers here today spoke quite a bit about some issues that many of us don't even think about as we begin to look forward to going to international operations. We spoke about a lot of different things here this morning. We talked about local content, cultural issues, contracts, local regulations and company regulations, and just a whole host of others. The most important part of these discussions, I find, are the question and answers from the audience. It gives the experts here, and I think they've demonstrated that, the opportunity to interface with you directly. And I'm sure you have some questions about what may be bothering you if you have in mind to go international. And I think you've got them seconded right here. They're locked in. We have people standing at the door so they can't get out. So, and this is free. So if you have any questions, any reservations in your mind that you'd like to have cleared up, this is a safe haven room. I'm sure we're amongst friends. So I would encourage you to ask questions, please. Anyone from the audience? Yes, sir.
Well, Mary, you didn't touch on embargo countries at all. There's a lot of expectation with our current administration what's going to happen. And has there been any new developments?
Well, I think only in terms of not significant changes in the embargo at this point. I think that it's more with being able to send humanitarian aid and things like that. So I have not seen that lately, that there's been any major change. I think we've got some changes coming in Cuba. We've seen that. That's been on one of the major embargoed country lists. And they do change, and I put that in here. The rules and regulations change regularly, and so don't just assume that you can send things. There's certain countries, like you mentioned, that are well-known, but other countries that are less well-known have restrictions for things other than just an outright embargo like we had in Cuba. So make sure you check those out.
Next question. No, I'll bring you the mic, thanks.
Well, for Mrs. Jones, is there a place that you can go to find out about your equipment?
Yes, there
Yes.
is. It's actually,
Yeah. Is there a place to go to where we can check our equipment and to see if it is?
yeah, there is. Now, I want to make sure that I'm clear, because you have certain permits that you have to get in order to import your vessels or your equipment into the countries. Those are required by the countries themselves. What I'm also talking about, though, is the export, and that's what you're asking about, is what are the rules of that? And if you look at I've got it in here on page 9, 10, at the very bottom of 10, I've got the OFAC, the EAR, and the ITAR regulations. And I'll tell you that when I start talking about ITAR and OFAC and EAR, it gets so complicated, so I don't want to go into a great deal. But if you start with what is the ECCN number of your product, and you can look your product up. I know you're smiling. It's really awful. That is it's one of the most complicated areas of the law. But if you have, and most things are not regulated. They'll be under EAR 99. But if you've got night vision goggles, right, and you don't know what the EAR number is on that, you can actually go to this website, and they will tell you. You can figure out where night vision goggles are actually dual use, so they're very highly regulated, but you can do a search. So most companies don't have, like with your product list, I mean, the best case scenario would be when you have all of your product lists, you'd also have your EAR number or your ECCN number. Generally, you have your harmonized tariff number on there, but you don't have the EAR number. So that's way more information than you asked for, but if you'll look at page 10.
Mary's also here too, so you can grab her. She'll be here for a while today. Another question, please? But I have one, certainly for Westy. I think when you, early on in your presentation, you had indicated, I think one of the first acquisitions was, I think perhaps in Australia, or you were doing work in Australia. Can you comment a little bit about local labor content there? I do know that there are certainly unions there to deal with, something that we oftentimes in our business don't have to deal with here in the U.S. Can you comment on how do you handle that transition and getting into your business there and then working with the local labor unions?
Well, that's certainly emblematic to Australia, but also worldwide. We are not unionized in the United States, but in certain countries we are. Australia is one of them. Very stringent labor laws. And so it's really just a broader ideology that you need to think about, not only just as it relates to handling labor relations or labor laws, but also working internationally. That's a fact of life in many countries. High wage inflation in Australia at this point in time, many restrictions, whether it's environmental, but also not the least of which Australia. Many times what you'll find in Australia, we're not that way, but many times what you will find in Australia is that most companies don't have employees. A lot of the labor force in Australia are independent contractors. And what they're trying to do is circumvent similar laws that you'll have in the United States, whereby you've got payroll taxes and other employee-related taxes and obligations. They try and circumvent that. And so be careful, because, and I'd have to check this about Australia, but this is certainly true in New Zealand, is the onus is on the company. And so what I mean by that is if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And so it's not the employee's responsibility in these countries to notify the tax authorities. It's the company's responsibility to notify the tax authorities that your employees are subcontractors or non-employees. So what I'm saying is, don't be surprised if you're operating in a country like in Australia or New Zealand, and all of a sudden the tax authorities knock on your door and you say, well, wait a minute. These employees, they're not our employees, they're independent contractors. I'm not liable for all these taxes. And they go, yes, you are. Because they look, talk, or quack and walk like a duck. They're your employee. And you, the employer, it's your responsibility to file the equivalent of a W-2 or withholding, not theirs. And next thing you know, you're staring down a big barrel of tax obligations that you didn't otherwise think you had.
Nor had you budgeted for. So
Exactly.
it'll definitely put you out of business quickly. And, you know, just on that particular subject as well, this isn't just about labor. As you go internationally, you really need to hire a good tax consultant that understands the underpinnings of the local tax requirements and laws in that particular country. And I think that's going to be very important. So thanks for leading us into that one. Eduardo, I have a question for you too, and that was going to be about developing local talent management. I know you did a remarkable job for us, and I think that's a pretty broad statement, you know, to make to the group. Do you have any specific ideas on, you know, how you would develop local talent management programs, and, you know, something you've done so well with? How would you approach that, or how might you suggest that for some of the people here?
Well, on local talent, what we did at Global is as soon as you have a long-term, mid to long-term program to establish in country, the best advice I could give is to reach out for universities, for younger guys. This is where the companies can plant the seed for future success of both the new generations as well as the company.
Thanks. I don't want to take up all the questions. Do we have any additional ones? Have we drawn any other questions out? I have one more from Mary. Mary's getting a lot of airtime here. One of the things I'd like for you to talk to, yes. Oh, sure.
Well, so when you said you reach out for the universities for to get the young talents, or are you talking about the country you're going to, or from United States?
The country you go to, I refer to that.
Oh, okay.
Establish connections with local universities.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
One more question for Mary, and that was going to be, you know, we talked a lot about compliance. We talked some about, and you always talk well to ethics and integrity and trust and developing those within your company. Facilitation payments. I mean, you may have touched on it, but can you spend a couple of minutes on if a facilitation payment is okay, or if it isn't okay, in which case it might be okay, or, you know, how should we handle facilitation payments?
You know, I think generally facilitation payments should not be made. While they are permitted technically under the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, they are prohibited under the UK Bribery Act, they're prohibited under the OECD convention. I think more and more countries are saying that's not acceptable. But you know, there's a real problem with facilitating payments in the U.S. Because it's very difficult to know what is truly a facilitating payment and what is not. And you're putting your employee at risk because you have individual liability and you are subject to going to jail if you violate the FCPA. And so my recommendation was always, unless your life is threatened, don't pay something. You know, if you've got where these things come up is a lot of times in customs or in some countries where you have to get permits. And, you know, these people in the various countries they're not corrupt individuals, but as a culture, you know, they have grown up where they got paid less, and that was part of how they were paid. So, you know, you don't look judgmentally on these people, because again, it's part of their culture. So you know, what I did in training is try to help people understand what's the best way to diffuse that situation. If you've got a piece of equipment that needs to go out and it's being held up at the port because you won't pay $100, you know, what do? You need that equipment out. And so your employees need to have tools on how to deal with that. And that should be part of the training. But in general, I don't think anyone any company should authorize facilitating payments, because 99 times out of 100, the government's going to not view it as a facilitating payment.
If you are pressured, I would suggest as well that you seek legal counsel very quickly to understand, not only to report it, but to understand exactly what the implications could be. So, as Mary said, be very, very careful with that. I think we're at the end of our session. I would like to present a very small token of our appreciation from Louisiana Gulf Coast Oil Exposition, LAGCOE, and thank each of our speakers for being here today and traveling from Houston, Lake Charles, Mexico, to be with us and share their insights. So I'll start with ladies first. Mary, here's a very small token of our appreciation for you. Mr. Westy Ballard, thank you for all your insights. I'll tell you, it was very impressive. And finally, I saved my good friend Eduardo, and thank his wife Monica too for making the trip over here. I actually sent him on a wild goose chase last night trying to find my dinner location, but we finally touched base. We missed having Mary. She got into a hotel that she said she wasn't very comfortable in, so we kind of missed her for dinner last night. But and of course Westy came in this morning. But Eduardo, thank you so much. That concludes our session here. We'll be here available to answer any questions or any guidance that you might have. Thank you very much for attending.